Reform, it's interesting you mentioned, are winning the TikTok war. So they have the most followers on TikTok out of all the main parties.
The Tory message of stick with us is really hard to land. Like Churchill couldn't do it after literally beating the Nazis.
If you care that much, go out and vote, and if you don't care, don't vote. That's your right in a democratic society. That's my view.
I've known of equipment, things like scanners and so on, being broken from being sort of lumped by bottoms, and used condoms, which is very environmentally unfriendly, being found out in alleyways behind campaign buildings and stuff like that.
Is there a political science term called butt crack?
There isn't, but I'm sure you could be that phenomenon.
You could write a thesis on it, couldn't you?
I could be Dr. Vaizey by the end of this podcast.
Dear God, help us.
Welcome to Howard Fix. I'm Ed Vaizey.
And I'm Becca Hutson. This is the show where we discuss and hopefully solve, with the help of a fixer, a problem that is plaguing Britain.
And right now there's only one thing we're talking about, of course, but it seems to be breaking those involved more than the general public. I'm talking, of course, about the general election.
Woo! Are you enjoying it so far? How's it been for you so far?
It's been great. I always love an election.
Yep.
Nothing like a good election.
No.
I wish there was an election every day.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, as a political junkie, I mean, it's great. I mean, when Rishi finally called it, I couldn't work out why he did it, but now he's called it. We're all into it. It's all exciting, and there's a new story every day. I mean, to a certain extent, general elections are very, very formulaic. You get the same old rubbish of, they're going to put taxes up. No, we're not. Have you costed your spending policies? Yes, we have. No, you haven't. But there are sort of gaffes galore. Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, is behaving like a small child, which is very enjoyable, deliberately, I have to say, falling into water at every opportunity. And, you've got Rishi, drowned rats, turning up to Wales and asking them how they're going to enjoy the football when they're not in the Euros, going to the Titanic. It's all great.
You're right. There have been lots of gaffes, haven't there? Not so many from Labour. Probably more serious than gaffes. I think the sort of purge that we've been seeing of kind of, I don't like the phrase hard left, but kind of leftist politicians, I think people are finding very uncomfortable, considering they've had quite a long time to deselect candidates like Vaizey, Shaheen, obviously the ongoing mess with Diane Abbott.
Yeah, so there are two high-profile candidates that Labour have kiboshed, or may have kiboshed. One is Vaizey Shaheen. She's definitely been kiboshed because they've actually selected a candidate to replace her, and she's a relatively young Muslim woman. She just gave birth to her first child, having had a caesarean section. I'm not giving anything away here. She's put all this out in the public domain. So she's got a 6-week-old child. She came very close to unseating Ian Duncan Smith in the general election in 2019. Ian Duncan Smith, a former Tory leader, so quite a big scalp. She came within about 2,000 votes of unseating him. And she's very charismatic. I've met her a few times. She's exactly what Labour need. Now, I'm a guy with Jewish heritage. Apparently she's liked a few tweets which could be construed as anti-Semitic. I looked at those tweets. They may be borderline, whatever, but we all know where she's coming from. She's a young Muslim woman. She'll be pro-Palestine and so on and so forth. And it does seem like very tough medicine. But now, of course, if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, you can be sure as eggs is eggs, within 6 months of being Prime Minister, some MP will like a tweet which is offensive, and he'll be told, well, hold on, you deselected a candidate a week before the general election campaign kind of close of nominations. Why are you now not taking the whip away from this MP? So he's set himself this kind of very, very high bar, or very, very low bar, if you like, for disciplinary action against his MPs going forward. So he has potentially, as I say, given himself a rod for his own back, which will come back to bite him, if I can mix all my metaphors.
I suppose you would never like a tweet that was problematic because you only like tweets about yourself. So you would be fine, actually, in this campaign.
Yes. I mean, I like tweets about myself, and sometimes I retweet tweets about myself. Mainly complimentary, always complimentary, because everybody tweets very nice things about me, because I'm one of the most admired people in the country. Yeah,
no, I would say so. You should write a little social media handbook maybe for these aspiring MPs.
But I never like your tweets because they're so boring.
My tweets are normally retweets of things about you, because you're probably the most important man in my life at the moment. But I'll note that. I'll try and make them more salacious. So none of the campaigns have been brilliant. What do you think does make a great campaign? Maybe what Reform are up to? I don't. Maybe that's a blueprint for brilliance. Just actually trotting out Nigel Farage.
No, I don't. I don't think. I don't think there is any great campaign. I think campaigns are very, very controlled, and they have been controlled for sort of 20 or 30 years. In the old days, your access to politicians was much easier, much more informal. We've become much more regimented in how we approach campaigns, and obviously, campaigns do change. So this campaign, more so than any other, cliche alert, is a digital campaign. It's a social media campaign. That's where a lot of the action is taking place.
Reform, it's interesting you mentioned, are winning the TikTok war. So they have the most followers on TikTok out of all the main parties. They're also the third biggest party under 24s.
Amazing.
Isn't that
having
astounding?
Destroyed the future of young people?
Yeah.
They're now being slavishly followed by them.
We're seeing it in Europe. So I suppose, is it much surprise that it's happening in the UK? I thought it was quite surprising.
I just don't feel that Reform are going to make a big impact in this election. And I think as well, when you get an election like this, when you're looking at potentially at change of government, people do kind of approach it in a binary way. I'm either Tory or Labour. I think a lot of Tory voters might stay at home. I don't think they're going to vote Reform.
Do you think too much is made of digital campaigns? Do you think people do pay attention to that stuff, or do you think we just enjoy the memes for what they are? I'd be curious to see whether any of these massive digital campaigns result in changes on, or a bit of a bounce on election day.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think, for example, Trump, the phenomenon of Trump, people think, oh, well, it was all digital and social media. It wasn't. It was because CNN and Fox News were wall-to-wall Trump because he was compelling, unbelievable, unusual candidate, and he was just box office for the TV. And I don't think digital does make that much of a difference, actually, weirdly.
So it sort of feels like we need to talk to someone who knows a lot about electoral campaigns, election campaigns, doesn't it? And as if by magic, we are so lucky to be joined by the one and only Cleo Watson, author and former political advisor. Welcome to the pod.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
You thought your career had peaked working on the Obama campaign, but actually it's appearing as a guest on How I'd Fix. So I'm glad we've made it happen for you.
So you've done 4 campaigns. You've done Barack Obama, you've done Leave, you've done 2017 and 2019 Tory election campaigns. What makes a good campaign, Cleo?
Oh, it's a good question. I think a combination of discipline, having a strong message and then having discipline around it, ultimately having very good people on board, and I think really capturing the mood of the electorate. So 2019 is quite a good example, that people just wanted, one way or another, they just wanted Brexit over, whether they were Remainers or not. They were tired of all the deadlock in Parliament, and that became the campaign slogan, get Brexit done. And there wasn't really a lot of deviation from that into other things. I remember Liz Truss wanted to talk about kind of trade deals with the US and all this kind of stuff. And we were very clear that we couldn't deviate from that message. I think also, to be honest, as part of that, we had a figurehead, obviously, in Boris Johnson, who just manages all the stuff we've been watching in the last week or so quite well. All the kind of gaffe-prone stuff he really leans into and can make it look part of his shtick. So you don't need to be quite as self-conscious as a lot of other campaigns have to be.
Do you think either of the campaigns have captured the mood of the nation? You've also got Labour talking about change with stability, which is not the most inspiring campaign, and then obviously you've got the Tories kind of clinging on. Do you think either of them they're not particularly inspiring or hopeful campaigns, I'd say, but do you think either of them have particularly tapped into how people are feeling about politics at the moment?
No, I don't. And I personally think we're going to have a very low turnout as a result. I think that the Labour change message is a strong one, in that the change message almost always does do really well, particularly after you've had incumbents for a long time. And, the Tory message of stick with us is really hard to land. Like, Churchill couldn't do it after literally beating the Nazis. The public don't stick with you because they're grateful. And if they're not going to stick with him, they're not going to stick with the Tories. But yeah, I think both are fairly uninspiring. But is that just a reflection of how people are feeling about politics, or is it the reason? I don't know. But no, I don't think either campaign is particularly exciting so far. But perhaps if you're Labour, that is very much part of what you're trying to do, because you want to bring in kind of Tory and Lib Dem voters. You want kind of comfortable people from Surrey and Kent to vote for you. You don't want to kind of freak them out with anything kind of reminiscent of Jeremy Corbyn.
I mean, if you were in charge of the Tory election campaign, how on earth would you turn it around for Rishi Sunak? Because as you say, stick with us is not a particularly powerful message. I mean, Churchill beat the Nazis, Rishi claims he's beaten inflation, but the Tories have been around for 14 years and they haven't exactly filled us with confidence over the last few years in terms of their message discipline.
I mean, I would build a time machine if I were brought in now and go back to at least a year ago, and I would take a much more aggressive line on a lot of his own MPs. And I think, to be fair to Rishi, he did come in to do a very specific job, which was to kind of steady the ship after Liz Truss, and he did do that. He is more popular personally than the Conservative Party is on, as a group. But I think it is very risky for him to go out in this presidential way and be the figurehead of it if he's going to be sent to the Titanic Museum and stuff like that. Like, they're kind of undermining their one key asset. And I think if you are talking about it's a bit like, Theresa May, strong and stable. You therefore have to make her look incredibly strong and stable, not a bit of a joke, dare I say it.
No, he is. I mean, standing in front of the exit signs, the visit to the Titanic Centre, making him get on a train when he's normally used to travelling by helicopter. I mean, if I were him, I'd be pretty annoyed at my top team, because I feel like, he's been slightly hung out to dry, hasn't he? Well, we're very lucky to have you here, because you're going to tell us how to fix election campaigns, because this one has been quite miserable so far, I'd say, wouldn't you?
Can we talk about sex?
Yeah.
Before we
it's a
get
great
on to the
song
policies.
by Salt and Pepper.
Cleo, you wrote a piece in the Times called Sex, Booze and Blunders, My Life on the Campaign Trail. So while we've been having this incredibly worthy conversation about message discipline, is there a different kind of discipline going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here comes a shameless plug for my new book, which is out on Thursday, the 6th of June, which is all about a general election and the shenanigans that go on behind the scenes. So you're right, the Times piece is very much a reflection of that.
You've got to tell us the title of your book, Cleo.
Oh, it's called, well, I'm sort of embarrassed to tell it, but it's called Cleavage.
Well, you're going to be having to say it a lot over the next few weeks, so you might as well get used to it.
Yeah, I know, that's true. It's named after a political science term, of course, not what you might think, Ed, you dirty-minded sod. Yeah, it's about...
There's a political science term called cleavage.
Yeah. A cleavage is the kind of wedges in society which are the it's like the natural groupings where you can put down a policy and a dividing line between them. So cleavage might be whether you've been to university or not.
Oh, is there a political science term called butt crack?
There isn't, but I'm sure you could be that phenomenon.
You could write a thesis on it, couldn't you?
I could be Dr. Vaizey by the end of this podcast.
Dear God, help us. The article was brilliant. I like the idea of the campaign crush that you wrote about, Cleo. I quite like the idea that people kind of have these mad, lusty affairs while they're out on the campaign trail. Exactly.
We're skirting around the issue. Let's get down to it. Cleo. What happens behind the scenes on an election campaign? Because your book is basically a bonkathon based around an election campaign.
That's right. It's also based around pornography, but we can get onto that another time, I'm sure. But what happens on these campaigns, particularly if you're working in the central office for those 6 weeks, you're not paid. You are working incredibly hard and very, very intensely to, get into government. And just strange things happen. You must have noticed the same thing, Ed, when there's a leadership contest in Westminster. It's like a little bit of blood in the water, and all the piranhas go completely bonkers. This happens in a general election setting. There's no HR process because these aren't employees. They're all there technically as volunteers and unpaid, and everything just they're tired. They're sort of strung out and excited, and all kinds of things happen against sort of photocopiers in the basement and that sort of thing. I can't say from personal experience, but I know.
I was going to say, what did you personally witness, Cleo Watson?
I don't want to get anybody into trouble.
You don't have to give us their names.
I won't give you their names. What time does this podcast go out? Is it
after 9
pre
o'clock
or post Watershed?
After 9 o'clock.
So I've known of equipment, things like scanners and so on, being broken from being sort of lumped by bottoms, and used condoms, which is very environmentally unfriendly, being found out in alleyways behind campaign buildings and stuff like that. And also just sort of stuff not on the premises, just sort of mishaps, a bit like the campaign crush I was talking about, where people have acted on it and then thought, oh God, I've gone back to this guy's flat and it's all pizza boxes. What was I thinking? The illusion has been shattered.
I wonder how much of that's happening on this campaign, because I don't think anything's been that exciting or sort of rousing so far. But I guess when the mood takes you, it takes you, doesn't it?
Yeah, nothing like a manifesto launch to get you excited.
Quite. Everyone's into something, I suppose. Will we talk now about making voting compulsory, which is almost as exciting as
what Becca's trying to do? She's now trying to get us onto your policies, because obviously the whole point of this podcast is how you'd fix things, and what we've asked you on today to talk about is not about sex, unfortunately. I've been banned from going on about this. People keep saying move on, which is really
can't fix that.
But it's about, you're in charge of elections, so you've got a chance to pass any legislation or rules that you want that would change how we do elections in this country. And we're told that your first policy is to make voting compulsory.
It's very sexy.
Yeah, very.
Smack of government
very
there.
Sexy. Yeah. Bum chicka whack whack. Compulsory voting. Like I said to you earlier, I have a feeling we're going to have quite a low turnout at this election, and I think one of the problems with that is that obviously not only does it show just kind of the general public mood and how they feel about politics in general, but it will give this whiff of illegitimacy to whoever does win, which I don't think is really fair. So if everybody were to vote, even with spoiled ballots, like that does at least capture the nation's wishes better than what we have at the moment. And I think it also gives that kind of political legitimacy to whoever does win, because people have turned out, even if 50% of the ballots were spoiled, that's still got people showing what they really want rather than sitting at home. It's just so tempting, if it's a kind of miserable cold day, even if you intended to go out and vote, to just not go out and do it.
So 27 countries have compulsory voting. Australia is probably the best known, and their turnout never falls below 90%, because if you don't vote in Australia, you get fined $20, and it can be as much as $200 if you don't pay the fine.
Would you fine people, Cleo, then if you didn't vote? Would you have a punishment?
Well, I think that's the beauty of it, actually, is that the punishments have to be so low to still work. Like $20 is not that bad, considering we don't fine people for missing NHS appointments. I think I don't know if I'd fine them, but I'd think of another way to punish them. It would be like the equivalent of a point on your license sort of thing, and I think you could explain yourself as to why you couldn't do it. Well, I think instead what you could do is there's a kind of coupon when you turn up to the polling station, and that knocks off 20 quid from your council tax, say.
Oh, that would be
that would be good. Yeah,
that would get everyone voting.
Well, what a sexy idea it would be, but
I think it's really sexy, and then you get political parties. Offering.
It's hard, Ed. I think it's hard
discounts.
to pick up the fines afterwards. I think it's much harder to go around and do the fine collection. I'd be interested to see how successful the Australian courts are in actually getting this money out of people. Whereas I think doing it the other way around, if people don't choose to take up their coupon, obviously that's up to them.
Ensuring it happens, though, would require everyone to carry some sort of form of ID then, wouldn't it? Which is another problem, because obviously now we've got you have to take ID with you to vote, and not every group necessarily has those IDs. So there's then a kind of financial penalty that you've got to go and get. some kind of photographic ID to go and do it. So it would cost lower income or certain communities more money to take part. Or would you then make voter ID something free?
Yeah, I think I would actually. I think we have. I think this is one of those questions that we have to decide on. There's all this. This leads into kind of a wide issue around governing. But if we do want people to be able to identify themselves, we're going to have to help them do it, because it is really expensive at the moment. And I think you could definitely have a means tested driving license or passport system. But I mean, there's studies in Australia that actually mandatory voting makes electoral fraud less likely. It lowers electoral fraud because everybody's turning out and it's easier to sort out. So obviously the ID argument is important, but the reason the Tories have been arguing to have voter ID in the UK is because of voter fraud and suppression, whereas actually it would cancel that out by having everyone voting and by dishing out IDs for them.
I'm not in favour of compulsory voting. I think we live in a democracy and it's everybody's right not to vote as well as to vote.
But Cleo makes a point that at the moment we're seeing it, aren't we, with this campaign? Like, the only people that any of the parties are talking to are their base, and it's kind of older people with houses. So if you're a young person at the moment, people are talking about you, but what policies are there for 18-year-olds at the moment?
If you care that much, go out and vote, and if you don't care, don't vote. That's your right in a democratic society. That's my view.
But it's not that they don't necessarily want to vote, it's because no one's doing anything to make their lives better.
That's a completely nonsensical argument.
No, it's perfectly
what does that mean?
Sensical. Why would you engage in a democratic process
if they bothered to go and vote, the political parties would start
Maybe
talking
it's a responsibility of the parties to court the vote, though.
I don't think so.
Right.
But I bet, Ed, I think it works both ways, because if they had to vote, I think people would bother kind of paying attention to what they're actually being told. I think it's difficult to say to people, you don't like it, you should start paying attention, watch Question Time, get an opinion and decide one way or another how to vote. Whereas if they're compelled to do it, it kind of forces that education and way of thinking about it, or indeed not, and just turning up and spoiling their ballot.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'd be a lot of willies drawn on ballot papers if you had compulsory voting, don't you think?
Well, fine, but at least it would.
It is quite funny because
that itself is a message.
Is a part of the process, isn't it?
When you go to, if you're a candidate in a general election, you go to the count where they're counting all the ballots, and any ballot that is spoiled or unclear, you put aside, and then the candidates huddle round with the returning officer and try and work out who that person has voted for. And there have been cases where someone has drawn a large willy on the ballot paper and the candidates are arguing whether the willy is in their box or their opponent's box.
Oh my gosh.
And if they can say that willy is in my box, they will then say that is a vote. Slightly unconventional, vote for me. I'm in favour. Well, I'm not in favour, but I'm agnostic to leaning towards votes for 16-year-olds, which is a Labour Party policy. And people forget 16-year-olds were allowed to vote in the Scottish independence referendum. And the right-wingers who think this is a disaster, Nadine Dorries wrote a very strong article about how, kids would be pestered in the playground. Not met many 16-year-olds who do playtime during school break. But anyway, she forgets that the 16-year-olds who were allowed to vote in the Scottish referendum presumably delivered the result she wanted, which was to say no to Scottish independence. I think Keir Starmer has a point. If you can get married, albeit with your parents' permission, join the armed services, although you don't go on the front line, get a job, why shouldn't you be able to vote?
Exactly. No taxation without representation.
What do you think, Cleo, since you're in charge for this podcast?
I suppose the Tory argument would be that's all the rights without any of the responsibilities. You should do a year of national service before you're allowed to vote. I don't know. It's a clever move from Keir Starmer, because if he does get 16-year-olds in, that's Labour in for generations.
Everyone assumes that's the case. I don't think that's the case.
Reform, maybe polling very well with young people.
Yeah,
God help us.
Or certainly Lib Dems or Greens or something like that. I think it's fine. I know a few 16-year-olds though, and I think, crikey. I'm not sure I want you. Not sure I specifically
Yeah, but I mean,
want
you could
you
say
guys,
that about
voting me. But
26-year-olds, 36-year-olds, 46-year-olds. I mean, I know a lot of 16-year-olds who'd be great, who've got very,
I think
mature views about politics.
But as a campaign move, I wonder whether it's a mistake from Starmer personally, because lots of grown-up people don't like it as an idea, and he's possibly turned quite a lot of potential kind of Tory swing voters, say, off him, because they'll think, I don't want that. I don't think it was a necessary thing for him to announce, because it didn't actually win him any votes now.
Right, well, tell us about your next campaign pledge, which is to
Sure.
reform campaign finance.
You promised to keep this sexy, which is the theme of the podcast, actually.
Yeah. How is campaign finance sexy?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think this is, sadly, I might have misled you. This is false advertising, but I do think it would be quite simple, if that helps. And so having worked on Obama's campaign, as you say, in America, I mean, the money the Americans have got sloshing around in their kind of war chest is absolutely bonkers. They spend billions and billions. And one of the things I think we do well in the UK is not having any wiggle room around our TV and radio advertising for political parties. We have those political broadcasts, which are always super fun and cool, and everyone loves them. And that's it. And I'm glad we can't kind of pump the airwaves with nonsense. And certainly, when I was in America, there was extremely libelous stuff being put out, literally as with Obama as an alien and that kind of thing. And I'm glad we don't get involved in that. But there are a couple of things I think would be worth looking at. And the first is the short campaign finance declaration. So at the moment, I mean, political parties can now spend a lot of money on general elections. It's up to 34 million. And actually, if you include the additional 19,000 per candidate they could spend, that's 46 million pounds in a year, which is pretty good going. The bit that I would like to change is during the short campaign, so during these 6 weeks, parties don't declare in real time who they're receiving money from, and they have a 6-month window after the election to declare it, where they are generally fined really quite a lot of money, up to £20,000 a time, for dodgy donations. And I just don't think it would be that difficult to have those things declared in real time so they can be scrutinised properly and arguably turned down. But it encourages this rat race to accept any money they can, because they think, oh, whatever, we'll just have to be fined further down the line and we'll worry about it then.
Okay, that's a good policy.
So I don't think that would be that difficult.
Real-time declaration of donations.
I love that. I think that's eminently sensible.
So it's all still there.
Yeah, we like those policies.
Yeah,
you're doing all right.
And you also did make that quite sexy.
You're
The
back in
real-time element, I thought.
I did. And finally, you want to stop us selecting nut jobs as candidates.
I do think we need to have an overhaul about how parliamentary candidates are selected. One of the big problems we have is that, I mean, I know hardly anybody who's a member of a political party anymore. So it means you've got this incredibly small group of people who are picking their candidates. I was talking to someone who will remain anonymous, who got selected for a very safe seat last year. And they basically understood that the kind of electorate they were appealing to were 100 people, really, in this selection. And actually, the hundreds of thousands in their constituency didn't really matter, because this was such a safe seat for them. The people to win over were the kind of very small group of Tory members.
I mean, I went on the campaign trail, obviously, to get selected for Wantage, and you do you get these lines. I'm not sure whether I should say them in public, but you know that you're appealing to quite a right-wing constituency. And I kept not getting selected because I was writing for The Guardian, and one or two of them found out that I was right. So they'd say, in your Guardian article, Mr. Vaizey, at which point, you were absolutely finished. But there was a particular line that you use, which right-wing Tories love a lot, which is you complain about the police, okay? So it sounds counterintuitive. You say the police never turn up to investigate any crime. and you tell this story, which you pretend is a true story, but obviously 17 candidates before you've told it, where you say, call 999, my house has just been burgled, and you know what, the police said, I'm sorry, we can't get to you, Mr. Vaizey, we're too busy. And I said, well, don't worry then, I've got my gun, I'll go and shoot him. And you know what? They turned up 5 minutes later, at which point you get a standing ovation. My favourite selection meeting that I went to was actually for my successor, because what happened, I was the last MP to resign in 2019 because it took me so long to stitch up my peerage with Boris. And at that point, obviously, the by-election rules kick in, and they selected 3 candidates, and they clearly selected one that they wanted, who was a special advisor, and 2 that they thought were no-hopers, so the special advisor would sell through. Anyway, the special advisor completely screwed it all up and kept name-dropping like mad, So whenever he's asked a question, he said, well, I'd get the transport secretary down here tomorrow morning. And they hated it. And then the guy who eventually got it, who is now a minister and won the seat, it was brilliant. It was like Forrest Gump, because I tell him this to his face, because he stood up and they said, Mr. Johnson, do you think we should have a railway station in Grove? And he said, well, I don't know. I've never been here in my life. I've no idea what you're talking about. And the whole audience, who'd had 14 years of me, obviously, said, at last, we've got an honest politician. And he won on the first ballot. And then the other thing that I always dine out on...
That's so surprising, because they normally say you've got to know the local detail, don't they?
I know, but they just loved the fact that he didn't muck about and just told me, he said, it's my first ever selection meeting and I've never been here in my life. It was brilliant. And then, of course, just to ram home how useless one's personal efforts are, is that I've spent 14 years as the MP for Wantage, and I got the vote share up from 37% to 56%, and I thought, I am the world's greatest campaigner. They just love me. And then this bloke Swansea campaigns for 6 weeks, having never been there before, gets 52% of the vote.
Oh my God! I'm finding this quite disheartening. So what do we do? What do we do? This is awful.
What's awful?
That's how people get these big jobs.
It's true. Cleo is right. I mean, there does need to be. I mean, I think it's funny because we started this podcast before you joined us, Cleo, talking about Keir Starmer kind of being ruthless with people like Diane Abbott, and this kind of obsessive checking of tweets and then deciding to get rid of people. Although I think it is selective. They're getting rid of people who they think might be a problem in Parliament. Contrast with the fact that, quite a lot of people just swan in to become Tory candidates and you've no idea who they are, and they're pretty eccentric. Now, I think there was one candidate during the last election who was so out there that all the women in central office threatened to walk out unless he was deselected. What was that story, Cleo?
This guy was selected, and then I think journalists actually found all these... a series of tweets and a conversation he'd been part of where they were having a discussion about rape, and he made sort of comments along the lines of, girls, what are you wearing? And if you're wearing certain stuff, you've got to expect a certain reaction from men, and stuff that, it was things he'd said a long time before, but they weren't appropriate at the time. They'd certainly not aged well. And unfortunately for him, I think, had Boris made a decision there and then to kind of cut him loose, it wouldn't have got so kind of public and kind of embarrassing for this guy. But he ummed and ahed, because obviously, Boris is someone who said some pretty controversial stuff himself in newspaper columns, and he's stood by it. But eventually there was a mutiny, and all the women working in Conservative campaign HQ said, if you keep him on, we're walking out.
Amazing.
So go girls.
But it is true. It is true. You should vet parliamentary candidates. I mean, it's crazy.
Why do we get the candidates that we get? And some of that is how the parties work. But it's a self-perpetuating cycle, because it's putting off people who would be really good from throwing their hats into the ring, because they think, I don't want to take part in that.
It goes to who you select as ministers as well, because any organisation, you're only having to effectively recruit 350 people. The fact that you cannot, first of all, be proactive and say we want X, Y, and Z to be candidates, and we'll go and woo them and entice them to join our, inverted commas, company. And then not to have a system. I mean, you were probably sitting in on the odd cabinet reshuffle. Not to have a system where you work out, that the person who ran, a major supermarket might be a good industry secretary, and the person who was a consultant surgeon might be a good health secretary, as opposed to some random person who's got a kind of status in the party. It's all very oddly done in terms of how you actually do kind of HR in politics.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, funnily enough, the first reshuffle I was involved with, Dominic Cummings sent me out to go meet with a bunch of kind of prospective ministers and find out a bit more about them. And when I came back, we were looking at the reshuffle board, and Helen Whately had been put into transport. And I said, but I've just met with her, and she worked in healthcare for years. Like she worked in health management at Bain or somewhere like that. This was obviously she shouldn't go into transport because she's actually got a bit of experience about how health systems work. And there was just no, you're exactly right, there's no concept of like wooden holes, round holes going into with round pegs. It's just patronage and how we want things to look. I mean,
anyway, I'm glad you brought it back to
I think
sex.
you're right. I wish we could recruit. Yeah. I wish we could recruit people though in the way that companies do, instead of depending on people having to kind of fight to make their way forward. Because there are good people who won't get involved because they just think that looks awful. And unfortunately, as many kind of passionate people as you say do come into politics, there are a lot of wrong-uns who are doing it for the wrong reasons. I don't think they are genuine public servants. I
mean, I was amazed that, I was lucky because I knew David Cameron, so I could basically ask him for the job I wanted, and I got it and just held on to it. But at no point do the whips, who are in effect, the head of HR for your parliamentary party, do they sit you down for a kind of job interview and say, right, what's your experience? What are the policy areas you're interested in? Do you have any particular areas of expertise that you can bring to bear? Now, I totally accept that in every job you do in politics, there's an aspect of being a good politician. People will disagree with this, but Michael Gove did not have to be a teacher to be, in my view, a good education secretary, or at least passionate about the subject and wanting to reform it. And I'm not saying you need a doctor to be a health minister, or you need a business person to be an industry minister. But having said that, you would at least say, these are the 25 people who've worked in the city. These are the 13 people who've worked in law enforcement. These are the 17 people who've been in the military. And at least have a list of people who've got particular areas of expertise when you're thinking about your next reshuffle.
Well, in terms of how I'd fix this, because I think I knew I'd have to think of something to actually help address this. At the moment, the only gating items to becoming an MP are whether you're current member of the armed forces or police officer, or if you've declared bankruptcy. That's it, which is completely bonkers. And I've been thinking a bit about Rishi's national service pledge and taking the army element out of it. I think that anybody who wants to throw their hat into the ring in public service, whether that's a senior civil servant or to become an MP or a member of the House of Lords or something like the chairman of the BBC, one of those public appointments, should have had to do a year of a weekend a month of working in a care home or being a hospital porter or whatever it is. And if you can't commit to one weekend a month of the less glamorous aspect of public service, then you can't do whatever the full 5, 10, 15 years that you'd like to do.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant.
I think it's insane.
Because it's doing something without the expectation of return.
You were doing so well, Cleo. Now you've gone off the deep end again.
Why? Why do you think it's so insane?
Why do you want to work in a care home just to be chairman of the BBC?
Wow.
You just answered the question,
exactly.
I think. I mean...
Oh, look, you both
I think it's really important.
I've said something controversial.
Yeah,
maybe the chairman of the BBC should be somebody who knows how to change a big organisation and knows a bit about media.
But then that just reinforces the same kinds of people get the big top jobs for the rest of time, don't they? If
What's wrong
if
with that?
we just over-index people from the professions who have been to certain schools and certain universities,
yes.
Whereas I think
That's
maybe
good.
people
That's
have
how the world should
people
work.
are made to work in a care home, they might have a little more empathy for how things work.
Empathy,
did
they've
not-
all
did-
got it in for me.
Did they not teach you that at your fancy school? We can talk about it afterwards. We've got to rate Cleo's manifesto, otherwise I think we'll get booted out of the podcast studio.
I'm against compulsory voting, so I call that a nuclear policy.
Right, well, I'm saying it's nuclear, but for the right reasons, because I think that's...
No, you've got to say it's safe as houses.
No, but it's not, is it? It would be a very radical thing to do, but it would mean that that parties have to start talking to
We need
everyone
somebody to come on the podcast
and
fix
explain the
our
rating. I think that is... But it,
Howard fixed the rating system.
Yeah,
of
quite.
Howard fixed.
Campaign finance was... I think we both nodded in firm agreement at that. We loved
Yes,
that. And
but it wasn't sexy, but we liked it.
so what we're saying that is also
That's
nuclear.
nuclear, yeah.
Again, nuclear. Two nuclear.
Candidate selection,
How to
nuclear, apart from this weird care home policy.
I'm going nuclear plus.
Right.
That was brilliant.
Well, you haven't been salacious enough, Cleo.
It was pretty salacious.
Your book Whips and your book Cleavage are both bonkathons, and you haven't given us any good sex anecdotes from politics.
That's true. Well, you'll have to read Cleavage to see exactly what goes on. But I can give you a quick summary if that helps.
Yeah, go on then.
You should get an episode in on how to fix pornography in the United Kingdom, because it's an absolute it's a minefield out there. I had to get a new laptop when mine exploded.
Really?
But it's It's this book is about a general election. It begins with the very unlikely premise of the Conservative Party heading for electoral oblivion. And then a maverick strategist comes up with a very clever campaign idea where from the outside the campaign looks like it's a complete disaster, but from the inside they're cunningly collecting people's porn habit data and putting together a very clever campaign that it does very well with internal polling. So who knows what's really going on? It could be that the Titanic and exit stuff are just clever gifts to keep us busy, while actually the real work of a campaign's going on behind the scenes.
Becca, do the political parties advertise on porn sites?
I don't know. It's actually very hard to buy advertising on porn sites, I think. That sounds like a riveting read. Ed would like to do a review of it, he was saying, actually, before we started. So do look out for what I assume will be 5
brilliant.
stars. Yeah.
Yeah, I reviewed your book Whips for the House magazine.
Nuclear, yeah.
You certainly did.
And I had to use the euphemism sexual instrument in my review.
Dear God.
Because I couldn't...
What? Not one for The Guardian, then?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Because there are quite a lot of sex toys feature in Whips. Is it the same in Cleavage?
Yes. Yes.
Superb. And on that note, Cleo, thank you for your time, and thank you for the political instruments that were your policies.
Thanks so much for having me.
Gosh, and that is all we've got time for. But worry not, Ed, because we will be back every week until the lead up to the election, fixing a problem plaguing Britain.
And to make sure you're with us every step of the way, follow us on your podcast app. Remember to download each episode or watch us on YouTube on Talk. Goodbye.